But the reason I'm here is because I read Renee's piece and I agreed, but I was kind of left, oh, it makes me feel uncomfortable in places. And the more I reflected on that, the more I thought, we've kind of gone through this period of time where we kind of were like, oh my God, there's a crisis. And we all just were paralyzed in this space. And I think that paralysis, we're kind of moving beyond that now, and we're recognizing that this is really challenging. There's a whole ton of ethical questions here that I don't think we're necessarily thinking through. And so partly what I want to explore today is, how does that, ooh, when I read that, how do we actually think about that and think about some different ways? And this partly comes from backgrounds. Like, I am an academic by training. I spend my time in civil society. I work in newsrooms. I have a very different background from Renee. And often people, if I say no to speaking at a conference, are like, do you know somebody else who's a woman? And I'm like, oh yeah, Renee. And so we kind of get lumped as like people who think about disinformation who are women. But actually we come from very different backgrounds. And that's kind of what I want to explore today, which is we've had this period of us all running around with our heads chopped off like chickens. I thought this was a slide with no blood. But we've also been throwing spaghetti at the wall. We've been doing a ton of post-it note action, Google Doc creation. There's a ton of money that's been thrown into this space. And we've been on a lot of airplanes, going to lots of convenings and talking about it. But I think kind of 3 years on from the time that, let's just be honest, America woke up to the problem. As you can tell, this isn't a Brooklyn accent. Those of us who've been working globally had recognized through a number of other events globally that this was coming, Brexit. So, but when America woke up to it, the funds started flowing in and we started really talking about it. But there are real challenges here. So I want to talk about this kind of spectrum of sectors who are thinking about this challenge. So we've got the intelligence community thinking very deeply about this. And Renee certainly comes much more from that space than I do. When I talk to Renee, I'm like, ooh, secret stuff. But that's not the world that I live in, and I don't want to live in that world. But it exists, and we have to recognize that it exists. And all the things that Renee are talking about is really important. But that is distinct from, again, thinking about NATO and the kind of conferences that NATO puts on, the way that NATO thinks about this. I don't get invited to those conferences, and I'm okay with that. But that's also distinct from things like the Atlantic Council, funded by 25 governments. The way that governments are thinking about this and what they're funding and how they're framing this problem is distinct, and it comes from a very particular way of thinking about disinformation. That is different from newsrooms. So I spend most of my time with newsrooms and fact checkers, and the way we think about it is much more about misinformation, which is what happens when audiences receive this content, don't understand where it has come from and why, and reshare it. How can newsrooms help educate audiences and report on that? With the challenge that if journalists do more debunking, if they do it irresponsibly, they can actually cause more harm because they're giving additional oxygen to those rumors. And many agents of disinformation are targeting journalists, understanding that they have the biggest megaphone. And if they can get newsrooms to either embed false information, there are hundreds and hundreds of Russian tweets are embedded on all sorts of news outlets. And in fact, recently I heard somebody from the New York Times say, if we see somebody tweet something, we will email them and say, we know you just tweeted this, but could you just put that in an email so that we don't have to embed a tweet and we need to make sure it's you. So in terms of the world that journalists are having to work in, it's very, very different. Now, there are more pressure now for newsrooms to help find this content and make sense of it and support the platforms in that work. Now, if you spend any time with newsrooms, they want to go nowhere near an initiative that helps the platforms. So I've worked on collaborative projects with newsrooms around the world, and we're like, so you've seen that, should we just DM, Nick Pickles at Twitter and see if he can take it down? It's like, no, because there's very clear boundaries about the way that newsrooms can't report and hold platforms to account while also sending them messages about what they're seeing. So there are real challenges here about you've got lots of newsrooms monitoring and verifying. What's their relationship to the platforms? The platforms, Facebook, are paying fact checkers to do fact checking for Facebook. That's really caused problems for fact checkers. But many of these fact checkers around the world are tiny and say, I can't say no to that Facebook money. So where does that leave us? Facebook are creating the world's biggest misinformation database created by fact checkers fact checking content for Facebook. But it's not an open database. And that database is not helping Google, Reddit, or Pinterest. So how do we think about those types of things? This is the Facebook third-party fact-checking project. And there's a scale question there. It took 18 hours for the Pelosi video to be deranked because it took 18 hours for a fact-checking organization to actually write the fact check about the Pelosi video. That's not sustainable. And then recently, Avaz, which is an activist group, has got into this space and has really spent a lot of money and time in Brazil and Europe monitoring the elections there. They're doing very good work, but they come from an activist perspective, which makes newsrooms feel very uncomfortable because they're coming from a particular activist perspective. And so there are many newsrooms now saying, should we report on this? How do we label it? Can we trust it? Where's the transparency? So newsrooms are having challenges here. And I feel bad, whoever created this slide. I found it on Google Images last night. But I just want to remind ourselves that in this whole space, we have PowerPoint slides like this, and we have the spooks with their like Minority Report screens. And all of us are in the same space. But this is, the media literacy world of like really cute PowerPoints and like interactive games that are meant to be educating audiences. Like, this is a huge, huge space. And we have convenings where people invite people like Renee and I and say, can you talk about like the fake news crisis? And the complexity is something that we've really, really got to handle. One of them is funding questions. There's a lot of government money out there. I work with an organization called First Draft. We currently have a policy where we don't take government money. And some people are like, yeah, but you can take Swedish and Canadian money, but you can't take US money. And we worked on the Brazilian election. We had Brazilians saying, please tell us that you didn't take US money because, the US government really interfered in our elections. So when we talk about state interference, I'm just going to say it because I'm British, we also have to recognize, my country has interfered in many elections around the world in previous historical moments. So this is much more complex, and we have to really think deeply about what all this means. We take Google money. I'll just put my hands up. First Draft was created and partly funded by Google. They have allowed us to do a lot of work that we couldn't have done if we had to wait for traditional funding cycles. And so that's why we've taken that money. Does it make me feel awkward sometimes? Does it mean that I stand on stage and, I am critical of the platforms? I have to be, otherwise the work becomes, it feels like I'm an advertising campaign. So again, I every day am walking these tightropes. And then there's, we also take money from Open Society foundations. Does that mean that we get attacked? Yes, because we take Soros money. Should I be taking Charles Koch money? Like, this is really hard. And we just don't have the guardrails right now to figure out all of these different challenges. And so I think all of this means is we're growing up. We've had 2.5 years of paralysis. And now I think we just have to recognize this is incredibly complex, but we need new ethical guidelines around things like funding, ethical guidelines about reporting, ethical guidelines about who we sit in a room with and who we don't. I was at a conference before Christmas, small convening, lovely bunch of people, no introductions at the beginning, and halfway through the afternoon, a guy says, hi, my name's Clint, I'm from Homeland Security. And I was like, Clint, you seem like a lovely man, but I would not have said half the things I'd said today if I knew that you were from Homeland Security. P.S. I'm halfway through a green card application. I mean, this stuff is really, it's really hard. But I think this is, again, we're just growing up. So I'm currently a TED Fellow. You can't do a talk without this slide, which is remembering that we're just all part of one big happy family, which makes me worried about how do we frame this? Because yes, foreign interference, but we're all interfering with each other. And how does this look like when this is truly a global phenomenon? How do we frame it? How do we work on this consistently? From all the conversations about content moderation, I'm from Europe. We have a much lower bar when it comes to hate speech for all the reasons that we heard in that very powerful opening speech. We don't accept some of the kind of speech that here, I understand why, but there are huge differences. So how do we have global responses to something when we have very different cultural ideas about this? And ultimately, I keep saying, we've got to stop thinking about solutions. I cannot be in another breakout session at a convening when somebody's like, 10 more minutes till a solution. I'm like, and I can't build another Chrome extension. I mean, we're sort of in this desperate moment of we need to, like, it's all about how do we change the supply side. This is just our new reality. It's the fact that we all now put sunscreen on when we leave the house. We live in a different reality now, and we need to build resilience so that people can understand how to navigate this world, because it's not changing. We're only going to have more information, more polluted information. It has to be about resiliency. And how do we do that effectively? And so I don't know whether this is the right image, but we're all in this together. We all have to be somewhat connected, but how do we ensure that we are sitting on our separate seats? And I don't know what that looks like, but I really think we need to start having these conversations, because I think believing that we can all be in the room and we can all think about this in the same way, I loved your slides, Renee, but all of those emojis, this is complex. There's a lot of different emojis to describe this very complex area. How do we take an emoji and sit with it and have our own ethical guidelines about that, but sometimes have a big emoji conference? I don't know. I haven't got the answers, but I just really want our conversations now to be more thoughtful about the challenges, because we've got to recognize it's 3 years on, we've grown up. This is hard, but it's not going anywhere. Thank you.